Hi, this is Rick Rogers. Welcome to my video in which I present a scenario for the 2020 presidential election. I should start by saying that it is September 24th, so we are more than a month away from the election, which means things could change as events in the election change. If we see a massive change, that's just a reason for another video. I call my scenario a worst case scenario for two reasons. First, it does reflect that I have a preferred outcome in this election. I am an independent voter. In the past, I have voted for Republican, Democratic, and independent candidates. In this election, my preferred choice is Joe Biden because I believe that he will bring the civility and character that we need to restore in the Oval Office. So when I say worst case, I'm asking myself, how hard is it for Joe Biden to win this election? What happens if things go wrong? The second reason I am using the term worst case is because things did go wrong in 2016. People were too confident about a Hillary win. And it is my conviction that a lot of the information that we needed to know about whether or not the outcome of the election was in doubt was already in the polling data. So some background about why I'm doing this and some things I use as broad principles, not specifically assumptions about my model, is that I do think that the 2016 polls were not wrong. I realize that's contrary to what you have commonly heard, but if you look at the popular vote projections, the poll of polls average suggests that Hillary would win by roughly 3%. And if you were watching the last weekend in the polls, you could see that with the second exoneration of Hillary for her emails, that while the nation as a whole was responding positively, the battleground states were not. So you could not predict the outcome of an election, and I don't think you can do that with polls, but you can see trends that are occurring, and you can build scenarios. And it is the scenario planning that I'm doing in this video. I do think that systematic data collection is more representative of what is happening than anecdotal stories. A lot of people I hear talk about the election will tell a story about houses they drove past or what their friends think, and I don't think that that's right. Most states are large and are very diverse, so what's happening in one part of the state may be different from what's happening in a different part of the state. So what we do need is systematic data collection to help us understand all parts of the state, not just the part we live in. Also, as a principle, I say once you create a methodology, stick to it. We will see a point in my scenario where my methodology actually skews a bit away from Joe Biden, not because of assumptions of the methodology itself, but just because now that I have this methodology, some things that I think are going to happen, I can't say are going to happen because I'm following the numbers. Although my scenario, although in working this out, I'm pro-Biden, my scenario itself has assumptions that make this pro-Trump. Here's the scenario. Right now, I believe that Joe Biden is leading in the race for president for the United States in the popular vote by about 7 percentage points. I want to draw attention to the percent uncommitted. These are people who have not said who they are going to vote for or haven't decided yet. Notice that it's 6.1%. That 6.1% will be important when I work out my scenarios. In the all-important Electoral College, I see right now Joe Biden with 275 electoral votes versus 263 for Donald Trump. Here is the breakdown of my scenario for the Electoral College by state. I classify a state into one of 5 categories. On the far left, we have Biden majority states, where according to the poll of polls averages, Joe Biden appears to already have at least 50% of the vote. The next category, which has only one state, Wisconsin, is a state where Joe Biden has a lead that is so large that it overcomes any handicapping that I have modeled for Donald Trump. On the far right, we have the states that I have assigned to Donald Trump. In the middle, we have two categories of toss-up states. Toss-up states are states where Biden is currently leading, but where the handicap for Donald Trump leaves the result uncertain. The column Biden leaning are those toss-up states where Biden's lead is at least 3%. On this table, we do see one of the places where I'm following the lead of my methodology for reasons other than the assumptions themselves. Under toss-up Biden leaning, you will see two states, Colorado and Virginia, which most people will think will go to Joe Biden. The problem is right now there's not a lot of polling in those states. So while I'm respecting that opinion, I am less confident until we see more data. So you do if you are committed to a methodology, you do have to stick to it. Second, when we look at the toss-up Trump-leaning states, notice that I said all of my toss-up states, in the way I worked out this worst-case scenario, are states where Joe Biden is leading. So we have this additional 59 electoral votes in Arizona, Florida, New Hampshire, and North Carolina, where right now, because of my modeling, I would assign them in my scenario to Donald Trump. But in fact, there is a possibility that these states could actually go Biden in the end. Finally, we need to take a look at some of the states in the Trump column. Georgia, Iowa, Ohio, and Texas are all states with very close races. In fact, Georgia, Iowa, and Ohio flip back and forth between a Trump and a Biden lead, depending on the poll of the day. So there are additional opportunities here. I point this out because some people are looking at the electoral map and saying we're going to have a Biden landslide. If all of these states that are toss-up states go to Joe Biden, we will have something close to that, and there's a possibility of other states currently assigned to Trump that could also go to Joe Biden. So although I'm doing a worst case scenario, one could also do a best case scenario, which is incredibly favorable to the former vice president. So now I want to talk about my assumptions in my model. And to start, let's look at polls in general. A lot of people don't like polls because they're not always accurate. But again, they give us a systematic look at what's happening in a location. And they're far better than relying on anecdotal stories. So election polls try to do two things. First is to identify support for a candidate based on a random sample. I won't get into technical details here, but random sampling in this environment is really hard to do because some people are best reached by landlines, others best by cell phones, others best by the internet, and each of those communication systems have their own problems when you're trying to reach people. I'm quite thankful that that's not my job to figure out how to do that. A second, election polls try to estimate the likelihood that a person is actually going to vote. And this is based on the person's voting history, as well as the historical turnout for the voter's demographic group. There are some problems with these likely voter estimates, which can lead to wild swings in the polls. So two polls could have the same underlying results based on their respondents, yet because of certain assumptions might report something very different. First are the different assumptions about turnout. This matters a great deal in elections because it is a model, and if the assumptions change, such as we have with the pandemic, it could affect what our estimates are supposed to be. Of course, we don't know that the assumptions are going to change till after the election's over. So that's why they rely on history, and history is not always reliable on this point. The other point to look at, and this is why history is not always reliable, is that turnout numbers do not capture enthusiasm. So in 2008 and 2012, the polls often underestimated the turnout of Blacks in the United States. They didn't fully capture the enthusiasm of Black voters for Barack Obama. And the reason for that is that black voters are more likely or are less likely to show up at the polls than individuals who are white voters. So that created a whole problem in modeling expectations for the election. Same thing happened in 2016. The polls did not properly model the enthusiasm of white working class voters for Donald Trump. So here are my assumptions for my scenario. I do accept the poll of polls idea. So the idea of the poll of polls is that all of the polls together in aggregate give us a better understanding of what is happening than any individual poll. Any individual poll could be way off based either on a bad sample or bad assumptions. But the different polls with different sampling techniques and different model assumptions regarding turnout tend to average each other out. So we get a much more reliable prediction of the possible outcome using the poll of polls theory. With swing states, I use no polls that are over 14 days old. That's to accommodate short-term changes in the electorate. I weight the polls by the quality of the poll and recency. For quality, I use the grades that are assigned by Nate Silver at the 538 website. I think that's something that he does really well, and that's actually pretty hard to do all of that. So his work is admirable. In some cases, when poll results are published, multiple scenarios are given, and that's because the polling agency is trying to work out different turnout rates based on different modeling assumptions. So I always select an estimate that's the worst case for Joe Biden, because I do want that worst case scenario. And I do have a strong preference to polls that have likely voters in them. Not every poll uses likely voters. Some use just adults and some use registered voters. But the likely voter polls do seem to give you the best results. I award a state to Trump if Trump is ahead, even narrowly. I don't do that for Biden, and that's another assumption I do to make this a worst case scenario for Biden. Probably the big thing is my 5% handicap for Trump. A 3% handicap is really more normal, given the types of errors involved. So there's some groups that might get sampled. It's not large, but it could be large enough to affect an election outcome. So you want to give yourself a little hedge. But between the voter suppression initiatives and the mail-in voting, which is going to cause a lot of rejected ballots, and the majority of those are going to probably be for the Democratic candidate if history holds up. And also, when we look at possibly lower turnout among some demographics because of the pandemic, I raise the handicap for Trump to 5%. Now, that handicap could be larger if there is a large group of uncommitted voters, according to that poll. So I mentioned my national average is 6.1% for uncommitted voters. So if I had a state that had 6.1%, I would give Trump a 5 percentage handicap, but I'd add on there another 1.1%. So Trump's effective handicap in that state would be 6.1%. So it's a really high threshold that Joe Biden has to clear for me to assign a state to him. And then in the toss-up states, I looked at the more conventional definition, since I did think some of the toss-ups would go for Biden. So those states that have the 3% gap, which is the more conventional handicap, those states I am awarding to Biden. And those are the states that I would really be watching on what looks like an election week this year. So some conclusions about what I think is going on. First, I do think that Joe Biden is ahead. My scenario is a worst case scenario. There could be much better outcomes for Biden. I know the media tends to talk about issues it doesn't like in the Biden campaign. And I think that's because Democrats sense a chance for victory and they don't want it to fall away or squander this moment as happened with Hillary. The real candidate in this race who is desperate is Donald Trump. I should make some comments about the polling. The higher rated polls seem more favorable to Trump. That doesn't necessarily mean that the state is assigned to Trump, but that does mean that the gap between Biden and Trump are smaller. And certainly if you are a Biden supporter, you're concerned about that. Also, the state polling in general is erratic. Normally, I tell my classes that you want to have 800 to 1,200 cases if you have a survey and you want to generalize to a large population. And I do that for statistical reasons. We won't get into the math here, but something happens at about 1,200. But when we look at some of the current state polls, including those of top-ranked from the top-ranked polls based on their historical performance, a lot of state polls are only giving us 400 to 700 people. When we look at the trends, although the gap is narrowing, Biden's totals have been staying largely the same over the summer. The shifts have been coming from that uncommitted group of voters who are shifting to Trump. So that's one of the reasons why I want to factor them into my model. But also the same thing happened in 2016. Uncommitted voters do appear to be trending towards Trump, and that could substantially narrow the gap by the time we get to Election Day. About individual states, I think right now the most important state in this election is Pennsylvania. It is out of the toss-up states that I'm classifying as Biden leaning. It is the state easiest for Trump to pick off. It is also the state where we could have some of these post-election issues. So what's happening in Pennsylvania is turning out to be a big deal. Notice in my scenarios that Biden can win without Florida, Arizona, or North Carolina. Right now, he is leading in all three states. Regarding the trends, I want to draw attention to two items. First, turnout is everything in this election. It is generally assumed that if we have high turnout, that it's going to favor the Democratic candidate based on recent history. There is some concern here about the turnout. The progressives are still not completely happy having a moderate as their presidential candidate, and some of them sound like they want to sit out of the election. Progressive leaders, to their credit, are saying it is essential to vote for Joe Biden, or we could end up with Donald Trump. The second thing about turnout is that the Democrat registration machine does appear to be broken. Florida and Pennsylvania in particular are states where the Republicans are out-registering individuals of their party than the Democrats. And the Democrats have a particular problem in that they rely a lot on campus recruiting. And because of the pandemic, it is hard to recruit in college campus settings. So I do think that turnout is questionable. But if we have the kind of turnouts that we saw in 2018 with the midterms, then this election is going to go towards a best case scenario for Biden and not the worst case. I also think to understand what the campaigns are thinking, it's actually interesting to watch the candidate travel and the ad spends. Candidates aren't going to spend a lot of time in California, or the Democratic candidates are not going to spend a lot of time in California. I'll take that back. Neither candidate's going to spend a lot of time in California or spend money in California because we all pretty much know that California is going to vote for Joe Biden. But it is interesting to see some of these other states where decisions are being made. And so for the Democrats, this week we expect to see advertising begin in Georgia and Iowa. So what the Biden campaign is saying is they see in their internal polling the opportunity to flip those two states. Also, when we look at the Republican side, suddenly there appears to be a rush to get more money into Texas. What that means is a state that we would think would go Republican, that the Republicans are now on the defensive in the state of Texas. So Biden is what they say expanding his map. And so those things are really interesting. When a candidate is starting to go outside of the geographic base, that's a sign of confidence on the part of that candidate that things are going well in the states where the candidate is strong. So I'm putting out there my worst case scenario may not be that way. I certainly want to thank you for watching this video. And if there are significant changes, I will certainly do another video in the future. Thanks. Bye.